Welcome back. And if you're joining us for the first time, welcome to the Disability Symposium, sponsored by the Weingarten Center at the University of Pennsylvania. This is the second session of 3 great sessions today, and we hope you will stay with us all day and come back for the final segment at 1:30. Just a little housekeeping for the audience. Please note that the closed captioning option is available in the lower left side of your screen, and you can turn that on by pressing the CC button. Also, this session is being recorded, and it will be posted on the Weingarten Center website, where you can also find complete information about full symposium lineup from this year, speaker biographies, and the recordings of all the sessions for the year. Throughout the session, audience members are welcome to use the Q&A feature, actually encouraged to use the Q&A feature to share your questions and responses to the talk. And we'll leave some time at the very end of the presentation to have our speaker field those questions. My name is Aaron Spector, and I'm the Director of Disability Services here at the Weingarten Center. And I'm joined backstage by my colleague, Valerie Wren, who's the Associate Director of Tutoring, to serve as moderators for this session. The Weingarten Center is Penn's home for academic support and disability services. Our staff strive to form authentic relationships with Penn students as they grapple with the rigors of academics and the journey of identity development. We often meet students at moments when they're trying to make meaning of some of the biggest challenges they've faced. It's difficult and rewarding work. This is why I'm so excited to introduce our next speaker. Naomi Jackson is an accomplished author and an assistant professor of English at Rutgers University, Newark. You can read her biography and the long list of accolades she's received for her excellent novel, The Star Side of Bird Hill, on the Symposium website. I'm honored that Ms. Jackson accepted my invitation to speak at our symposium this year. I contacted her after reading her essay, Her Kind, A Meditation on Losing and Finding My Mind, in Harper's Magazine. And I just felt that the disability profession needed to hear from her. Her vivid description of the onset of disability, a disabling mental illness, and her attempt to make meaning of the experience. I was moved by how the essay painted mental illness as both an inheritance and a family secret, both connecting and divisive, which I think ties really well into our theme this year for the symposium of reflecting on the past and planning for the future. Her talk today is titled, Why Be Happy When You Could Be Normal? And it is my pleasure to introduce Naomi Jackson.
Great. Thanks so much, Aaron. I want to say thank you so much to Aaron and to the Weingarten Center at Penn for inviting me to be in conversation with you today as part of the 20th Annual Disability Symposium. Before I get into some of the prepared remarks that I made, as we were talking this morning, I was remarking to Aaron what a unique and challenging assignment this was. What could I say about disability to folks who work in the field? Usually I'm invited to read from my novel and more recently from some of the essays that I've published, but trying to write in a really directed way about disability was really challenging and exciting. And I hope that this is something that becomes part of the essay collection that I'm working on right now. So thank you again for having me. It was certainly provocative, both creatively and professionally. So as I thought today about the 20th Annual Disability Symposium, I started to think about what my life has been like over the last 20 years. The 20 years marks the span of time since I graduated from Williams College in 2002. In the last decade, I've published a novel and essays, and I've taught at colleges and universities, from huge public ones like Rutgers University, Newark, where I teach now, and Queens College, to small liberal arts colleges like Sarah Lawrence and Oberlin. As I've become a teacher, I've noted how different the generation that I encounter in the classroom was from the generation I attended school with. I've been in awe of the way that my students readily disclose their mental and physical health diagnoses, the way that they feel entitled to request and receive support that will allow them to fully participate in their education. Gone are the days when people, myself included, knuckled through their difficulties alone, mired in shame. Gone are the days when requesting an accommodation was seen as a sign of weakness or an attempt to game the system. Or at least I hope those days are gone. I think that, as the movie says, the kids are all right, and that the openness around the many challenges our students face is an important first step to facing and working through them. Still, the obstacles are considerable. Anecdotally, right now, I know several parents that are struggling through their teenage children's surprising and severe spirals into anxiety and depression, including hospitalization and navigating the considerable task of trying to find quality mental health care. 2 years into an ongoing pandemic, we are seeing the fallout in terms of our young people's intensely compromised mental health. I can imagine that the work that you've been doing during these years in collaboration with and on behalf of students, staff, and faculty has been wearying. I can imagine that you are, like so many of us, both exhausted and bewildered. I want to take a moment to say thank you for the important work that you're doing to support students' academic pursuits at colleges and universities around the country. The work of getting an education is never a solitary task, and I want you to know that in my work as a university professor, I find the support that I get around students' accommodation requests to be invaluable. Your efforts, I know, go far beyond that, and they do not go unnoticed. In this conversation, I'll offer some emergent ideas about my own experience receiving and recovering from a diagnosis with bipolar disorder. I'll start by reading the essay that I wrote, well, in a while, that appeared in Harper's Magazine last fall, and then move on to talk about how my thinking is developing about how identifying as a person with a disability has affected my life and work. As I was preparing this talk, I opened an electronic folder on my computer labeled Presentations. Much like the rest of my life related to my writing, there was a yawning gap in that folder, and the last presentation was in 2017. 2018 was the year I got sick, and there's a big hole on my CV, in my life, even in my Dropbox, a big gap when I stopped actively publishing and teaching and being part of my beloved creative and artistic community. I began writing this talk thinking about the lacunae. What did I miss? What didn't I do during the years when I was sick, and then in the years when I was recovering and rebuilding my life? There were the big things, the bylines I didn't get to celebrate, the jobs and friends and colleagues I lost. And then there were the little things, the parties I wasn't well enough to attend, the fact that I never got to dress up to see the first Black Panther movie. I found myself feeling troubled, though, by the way that I was approaching this talk from a framework of loss, because I'm so bothered by the way that people with disabilities are called upon to present what they don't have, what they don't do like other normal people, and how their losses or deficiencies mark them as somehow inferior. But then I woke up this morning and listened to a news program about beloved artist Yayoi Kusama and learned that the whimsical, stunning sculptures that I fell in love with last fall at the New York Botanical Gardens, the art that has made her an internationally renowned artist, was made by a person with a severe mental illness, a person like me. The news report recounted the fact that Kasuma lives in a psychiatric hospital now, and that she crosses the street each day to spend the day working in her studio. I was struck by the way that Kasuma, for now, is able to be both sick enough to require intensive care and well enough to make her work. I was struck by the way that her art sustains her, and that her art is made not in spite of her mental illness, which includes visual and auditory hallucinations, but because of it. Kasuma's story reminded me of the ways that hearing about the mentally ill people who've gone before me and made great contributions to society sustained me and gave me hope. And I'll pause here, as I'm thinking this through. I think in hearing the story about Kasuma, I started to think not just about what has been lost to illness, but what might have been lost if the voices of people with mental illness are silenced. So in terms of thinking about artists with similar diagnoses whose work inspires me. I think about the musician Nina Simone, who had bipolar disorder, about the artists Ramir Bearden and Sam Gilliam, about the Grenadian-born mother of Malcolm X, Louise Little. In the days and weeks and months when I was flattened by my illness, I found hope and inspiration in their lives, which were proof that two things could be true: that I could both have a severe mental illness and be an artist, that perhaps one thing could be bolstered by the other. And so, in the process of thinking about what I had to say to you today, I was moved from thinking about the way that I experienced being sick as a kind of tally of losses to thinking about the way that my illness changed me and the way that being sick left me with new gifts that I didn't have when I began this journey. Maybe it's helpful to stop here and read the essay that I wrote and that was published in Harper's last fall to give you a sense of what I'm talking about. I'll take a brief breaks along the way to talk about the topics that come up. The essay is organized into several sections. There's an introduction that sets up what happened, a brief telling of my family's history of mental illness, and then a foray into my childhood and how it might have impacted the mental health issues that came up later on. I describe an encounter with the police when I was sick, a consideration of how community both failed and supported me when I most needed it. And I also share a word on recovery and coming back from these difficult moments. I'll pause after each section to speak briefly on some of the things that came up during the writing process and why I chose to write and edit the essay the way that I did. So, the title of the essay is Her Kind on Losing and Finding My Mind. And just in terms of giving shout outs to the artists who inspire titles, I'm a terrible title maker. And so one of the ways to overcome that is to just steal titles from other artists. So the title of this talk, Why Be Happy When You Could Be Normal, is taken from Jeanette Winterson's really phenomenal memoir about growing up in England. And the title of this essay is taken from a poem by Anne Saxton. So I'll begin by reading. 3 springs ago, I lost the better part of my mind. I remember it starting with my feet. I woke up one February morning in the apartment I just moved to with my husband, and my feet were so swollen I could barely fit them into my roomiest sneakers. I called in sick and rode the train downtown to the doctor, who told me my blood pressure was perilously high. The news didn't come as a shock. I had been working and worrying nonstop. I was in my first year of a new job at a nonprofit. During breaks, I called the cable company, the gas company, the furniture store. I wanted everything to be just right, for the apartment to look instantly lived in and spotless, and I was sleeping less and less in pursuit of this perfection. I spent an excessive amount of money on linens for a dining table we didn't yet own. I imagined parties in a backyard that was home to both bountiful collard greens and stray cats. My doctor prescribed a 5-day course of water pills and told me to cut down on salt and fast food. I didn't know it then, but I would never return to that nonprofit. I missed a deadline to submit an important grant application. I stopped responding to emails and soon stopped working entirely. I called my boss's cell phone on a Saturday morning. Eventually, I think, she blocked my number. I was paid my salary for a while and then went on short-term disability leave. That leave was extended once. When I tried to extend it a second time, I received an unceremonious email terminating me from the job. I had been consistently employed since I was 14 years old. This was the first time I had ever lost a job. I was once described by people as steady, the kind of friend you could turn to for advice on buying an apartment or negotiating your salary. The year before I became sick, I started tumbling. transforming from a high-achieving, fiscally responsible, thoughtful person to someone you might call messy. From February to May of 2018, I felt profoundly unmoored, alternately joyful and inconsolable, fearful and invincible. I had never felt so free or so impulsive. My whims and emotions led me. My feelings were snakes that whipped me around. Some days, having a cigarette and a cup of coffee from the bodega, light with milk and 1 teaspoon of sugar, was the only thing that could cheer me up. What the world saw most was my rage. I'm typically a well-mannered person who's slow to anger, patient to a fault, a pushover even. I hate confrontation. But that spring I was furious. It was as if the weight of every unsaid thing and every unaddressed slight had built up in my body and was being released in one intense burst. I was mad and I had a lot to say. A wrong look or word was an invitation to spar. I cursed people out across boroughs. I was angry, but also afraid. My old fears of bridges, dogs, fire, things around my neck were joined by new ones, including a fear of riding the subway. For 6 long months, I couldn't travel underground. A 20-minute train ride to Manhattan became an hour and 20 minutes by bus and foot. I started having panic attacks almost every day. I know I could have crumbled, receded into the plush silence of my illness. I recognized myself in Anne Sexton's poem "Her Kind" from her 1960 collection "To Bedlam" in Partway Back. I have gone out, a possessed witch, haunting the black air, braver at night. Dreaming evil, I have done my hitch over the plain houses, light by light. Lonely thing, 12-fingered, out of my mind. A woman like that is not a woman. I have been her kind. So I have 3 days. So I'm going to read a little bit, talk a little bit, and maybe just talk about what the impetus was for writing this piece. So I got very sick in the spring of 2018, and I'll talk about the details of that in a moment in the next section. But I wrote this piece, I think, because I was feeling like even in a global pandemic, when there weren't that many occasions to see people, I felt like I had the weight of the unsaid story of what had happened to me. And I also felt like people were talking about what happened. And as a writer, I think what we most want to do is to be able to control the narrative. And I felt like the bravest thing and the most important thing was to write the story so that I could put it behind me. I had the very intense sense that I couldn't. Is my sound okay? Can someone let me know? Okay. I had the very intense sense that if I didn't tell the story, I couldn't get back to my work of finishing my novel that I've been working on off and on for almost a decade. But also just feeling like I was a creative person that was about unbound by whatever it is that people were thinking and saying about me. So the initial impulse, I think, was really an ego-based one, which was to control the story of what happened to me. And then as I started to research and write the essay, I began to think that there was something in it for people beyond me. And to be frank, I got scared in the actual writing process. I started to really understand that there was a lot of public exposure that would come out of publishing the piece, and that it was one thing to write this in a personal way and share it with friends and family, and another thing to invite strangers and colleagues into the story. But then I thought about the impulse for my first novel, which also involves a character who has a mental illness, and I was really writing that so that people who had experienced having a mentally ill family member like I did would feel less alone. And so I moved, I think, in the writing process. I'll talk about this later. It took me about 15 months to research and write this piece. I moved from the ego based impulse to correct narrative to own the story, and moved to a more sort of community care model where I was thinking, how could this piece serve people who have lived through these experiences? So, people who had lived through and experienced a severe mental illness, but also how could it serve people who love those folks, friends and family members who really actually were on the outside of whatever their beloved person was experiencing and really at a loss to understand what had happened to the person that they knew. So I think it's important to name, to be honest, that the initial impulse for this was actually not a generous one, but that the initial impulse gave way to something that was more generous and more involved with community. So I'm going to read the next section. As winter turned to spring, I slept less and less, sometimes only 3 or 4 hours a night. To pass the days, which stretched long and formless, I talked on the phone. In the early morning, while my husband slept, I called friends in Barbados. I called acquaintances and ex-lovers around the world, people I hadn't spoken to in years who were kind and patient, but unsure what to make of my rambling. They listened and grasped for polite ways to end our calls. I wanted to talk about my wedding, which had been held the summer before at City Hall with only a few witnesses. But mostly, I wanted to air out my wounds, to talk about who had hurt me. My husband was at a loss for what to do with me, how to keep me safe. So he sent me to spend time with my parents in Brooklyn. When I wasn't talking on the phone, I sulked, watched basketball, skulked around the house in a white nightie. I took long walks to the mall where I got into arguments and one-sided conversations with strangers. I tormented my parents and demanded that my father, a deacon, pray for me. One night I babbled nonsensically and crawled on the second floor landing of my parents' house, wanting to stay low lest the police see me. I heard my family start talking about taking me to the hospital, which unraveled me further. I lit a cigarette in the living room, an act of war in their tidy West Indian home. My father, who rarely raises his voice, yelled at me to get in the car. I tried to jump out as it was moving. My parents' stepbrother and cousin drove me to an emergency room in downtown Brooklyn. I rambled about SNL and The Cosby Show, about Oprah, Toni Morrison, Rihanna. By the time we arrived, my mood had shifted again. I was elated. As we ascended the steps to the entrance, I jumped with joy and clicked my heels together, telling everyone within earshot that I was pregnant with twins. I wasn't. The last thing I remember is a nurse with dreadlocks asking me questions and then administering medication that knocked me out. I woke up the next morning in a different hospital. My husband and stepmother were in my room. I joked that this wasn't how I wanted to spend Valentine's Day. It was either during this hospitalization or during one of the three that followed that I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder. I wasn't sure what the diagnosis meant or what it had to do with me and my life. That morning, I was furious that no one rode with me from the emergency room to the hospital a few neighborhoods over, that they'd left me alone with strangers. When my sister visited, I asked her how she couldn't be certain that the medical staff hadn't raped me. She said it was unlikely, but admitted she couldn't be sure. For weeks afterward, I couldn't write because my hand shook too much when I held a pen. I was terrified. I had written the entire first draft of my novel longhand, and I couldn't imagine not even being able to jot down ideas. A week after being released, I had an appointment with an endocrinologist. My family floated theories about a thyroid storm. Mercifully, no one said the obvious, that I was acting like a crazy person. But when the time came, I couldn't get myself to the appointment for fear of being readmitted to the hospital. I left the house that morning, determined to walk to Harlem instead. I wanted to see my hairdresser on Lenox Avenue, was somehow convinced that I'd be safe there. But again, I couldn't quite make it. I called my sister-in-law and an old colleague's husband for help. I called my husband from a funeral home on East 149th Street. I made it most of the way to the salon, but couldn't cross the Harlem River about a mile from my house. I think I knew that if I got to the river, I might jump. Finally, I called a childhood friend from a Dunkin' Donuts on the Grand Concourse, and she told me to stay put. She picked me up in her car and drove me across the river. I remember that drive feeling like a marvel, the water a surprise. So I think that's like probably along with another section in the essay, the most intense in terms of talking about what it was actually like to be forced into these situations with my family and going to the hospital, my fear and the intensity and the confusion. I think it's important to note, though, that despite the heaviness of what I'm talking about, I do have a sense of humor. And so it did feel important to include things like, you know, my cousins and my family, as much as they were afraid, were also laughing at a lot of the strange things that I was saying about musicians and writers. And I think that it's important to note that there was still some of me inside of these moments, even as I was moving towards being someone that felt really unrecognizable to my friends and family members. But it felt important to kind of pull the veil back and say, this is what it actually looked and felt like. And maybe it's important to say, lest you think that I am magically able to remember all these things, that it took a long time to both like confirm some of the things that happened with my friends and family members, but also to figure out a way to write about it. One of the things that happened in the wake of me being sick is that even though I have a pretty sharp memory, I wasn't sure about the actual timeline events, so which hospitalization came first, when things happened. And so it took quite a bit of time and effort just to put the story in place from beginning to middle to end. And I don't credit myself for that. I both had help from people who were there, but the structure of the essay really was not my own idea. It was something that came from the editors who I worked with in the process of revising this piece into something that could be shareable. Because the original version of this essay was very intense and written in both first person and in present tense in such a way that it was very bewildering. So I had a lot of help in terms of making this essay into something that was more easily digestible by people who weren't me. So I'm going to read the next section. In 1972, my beloved maternal grandmother was admitted for the first of many times to the psychiatric hospital in Barbados, known colloquially as Jenkins, after the former plantation on which it sits. Everything that is old is evil in Barbados, someone once told me. Nowhere is the truth of that statement more evident than at Jenkins, officially Black Rock Psychiatric Hospital, where patients in varying stages of distress and dissociation wander the same grounds their ancestors may have toiled. My grandmother was a loving, generous woman who doted on me and my older sister. She was always the first person to call us on our birthdays and insisted that people traveling from Barbados to Brooklyn bring us her excellent Bajan sweetbread. She was also intense. On an intake interview for a nursing home, she described herself as aggressive, one of the many reasons why her stay there was short. Granny called my father and stepmother's house at all hours of day and night, looking for somewhere to park her worries. My sister and I didn't have a name for Granny's ailment until she died. On a visit to Jenkins, we met with a psychiatrist who had cared for her, and she showed us records that had stretched back nearly 40 years, the early 70s. My mother has the same diagnosis. Her stays in American psychiatric facilities began in the 90s, not long after she lost custody of my sister and me. In her best moments, my mother was an attentive parent with serious ambitions for her children. She sewed black dolls, assigned summer book reports, took us to the library religiously, but she struggled through a contentious divorce from my father in the early 80s and the stress of raising two children alone in New York City, and her emergent mental illness eventually caught up with her. By the time I was 8 years old, my mother was no longer herself. Sometimes she was a carefree spirit who blasted Peter, Paul, and Mary and the Amadeus soundtrack while we cooked on the fire escape of the small apartment she'd bought in Crown Heights. At other times, she was catatonic, a present absence who barely responded when we needed her and occasionally disappeared for days on end. That summer, my mother lost custody of us. I will forever feel guilty for telling the family court judge the truth when he asked which parent we wanted to live with. My father, I said, hoping my mother would never know that I had betrayed her. At Daddy's house, the fridge was full, and there was always an adult around. My mother would cycle through homeless shelters, group homes, the streets, and occasionally an apartment for the next 30 years, traversing Atlanta, Seattle, Boston, and Barbados in search of something or someone. I don't know exactly what. I do know that I inherited my mother's hot foot and that Mommy, Granny, and I all belong to the same strange club of the severely mentally ill. So that was this section about my mother and grandmother's mental illness was like probably one of the hardest to write, not because I didn't know what I was writing about, but because I was really unsure whether to include it. I felt like what made my story unique was that I was very aware of the fact that mental illness ran in my family, and I'd really been haunted by the specter of getting sick for most of my adult life. So I was both haunted by that specter, and I think kind of had enough hubris to think that I was so smart and that my intelligence could somehow outpace this illness that ran in my family. Um, I think I was also concerned about protecting the privacy of my mother and grandmother, especially because my grandmother is dead and couldn't defend herself. Um, but I think in the end, going back to this question of generosity, it felt important to be honest about the fact that I had experienced this, but I had also experienced dealing with the mental illness of two close family members. And so most of the things that I was writing about in terms of my own experiences were things that I was outside of for the majority of my life. And I think there is a political statement there. I felt like it was important as a Black woman to be honest about the fact that there was the history of mental illness in my family, which is something that people often aren't. There's a big taboo, I think, in general, in terms of talking about mental health, but specifically in Black communities. And I felt like if I didn't tell this part of the story, I would be giving in to the impulse to say that being from a family with this kind of history is shameful in some way. And so I wanted to write against that. So, all right. Just checking in on time because I have other things that I want to say. One day in February 2018, I almost lost myself. It was unseasonably warm. I left the house in the early afternoon, the front door wide open behind me. I wore a black dress coat that I bought in France on top of a matching soccer jersey and pants that my husband had given me. As I walked up the Bronx's Third Avenue, I became taken by the idea of trying to prove how difficult it was for a woman to use the bathroom. I asked to use the toilet at a dry cleaner, a day spa, a State Farm agency, making scenes each time I was refused, sometimes claiming I was pregnant to see how far I could push the experiment. When I grew tired of the game, I stopped for a slice at a pizzeria, where I met a nice Black woman and her little girl. The woman had just picked up trophies for a soccer program she ran with her husband. She told me all about it as we walked 20 blocks north into a neighborhood I'd never visited before. Along the way, I yelled in French at a Togolese man. I could tell that the woman was worried about me and perhaps a bit afraid, but she was kind. Before we reached the southern edge of Crotona Park, I bid the woman and her daughter goodbye. I had what felt like an endless fount of energy. I wanted to play. I saw a pit bull I liked and followed the dog and its owner into a building that I later found out was a homeless shelter. I walked to the top floor and rang a few doorbells. No one opened up, though one lady spoke to me kindly in Spanish through her door. I ran outside where I saw a few kids. I introduced myself to one of them, who looked to be about 8 years old. Within a few minutes, we were shadowboxing. I asked him whether he knew about Muhammad Ali and Malcolm X, quizzed him between feints and jabs until we both grew bored. I told the boy that President Obama was going to officiate my wedding that evening on the Harlem River, that Rihanna would be performing. I told him he should come along and bring his crew. A dozen kids amassed to follow me. Then they realized I was lying. The mood changed. One of them, the oldest, cursed me out and chased me. I ran, weaving between parked cars, yelling back at him. I avoided a fistfight only because someone mercifully called the kids back inside. A tall, scruffy man who had been watching the scene pulled me into his apartment about a block away. I had to get a hold of myself, he said. I looked around his apartment, which smelled like cats had been peeing in it for centuries. There was a punching bag in the cramped living room. His girlfriend was a black woman whose skin seemed to glow in the dim light. The man said that I was too much, that I was upsetting her. She looked high. She looked like she had the same kind of problem as me. I told the man I couldn't stay long because I was running from the FBI. As soon as I said that, he shoved me out into the dark night that had descended. I headed to the Cross Bronx Expressway. I ran along cars on the highway for a while, stuck out my thumb for rides. I may have been trying to get to my wedding. I can't remember now, but no one would stop for me. I thought that the United Nations was in session. I was convinced I saw Robert Mugabe in one of the cars. Soon I was playing a game with myself, trying to see which African dignitaries I could spy on their way into the city. Suddenly I was unbearably hot. I stripped, peeling off my layers until I wore only a white tank top and green sweatpants. In doing so, I became my grandmother, who'd been known to stand on the road in Barbados in her slip until an ambulance came to take her away. That night in the Bronx, I waved my blue hoodie at a helicopter circling overhead. I was tired, and though I didn't want to go home, I knew I needed help. I sought refuge at a community center with a lactation station just above the highway, the woman with her babe, a beacon. A man there called the police. I had enough presence of mind to know to be afraid when the cops arrived. I knew that when mentally ill Black people spiraled, sometimes they didn't make out of these encounters with police alive. In 2012, Cherise Francis took her last breath in her Jamaican parents' clean basement after she was tackled by 4 police officers. In 2013, Miriam Carey, a Black woman with postpartum psychosis, was killed by police officers after driving her car into a restricted area near the White House. Her 13-month-old was in the back seat. In March 2020, Daniel Prude was pinned to the ground and died of asphyxiation after the police stopped him as he ran naked through the streets of Rochester. And that October, Walter Wallace Jr. was gunned down in Philadelphia while his wife tried to stop the cops by telling them he was mental. By the time the police arrived, I was cold. February's chill was wrapping its arms around me. I spoke rapidly in what I learned was later known as quote-unquote pressure speech. Though I'm unsure now of what I said, I remember putting my hands up to show I was unarmed. I told a female police officer that I had once wanted to attend medical school, but had to quit to follow my dream of becoming a writer. Even as I unraveled, I tried to present my most well-mannered professional self, hoping that my credentials might protect me. I got into an ambulance and talked with the medic the whole way there, grateful for the way he treated it like a taxi ride. So that was intense to talk about this day. I, went missing and this encounter with the police. I think when I originally also started to talk about this essay with the editors at Harper, it was on the heels of an essay that I'd written about giving birth in the shadow of the Black maternal mortality crisis. And so I had originally framed this essay as like mentally ill while Black. And I think the piece ended up being a much more personal and less political piece, but it felt important in this section to talk about how my experience of encountering the police was marked by the fact of my race and also marked by the fact that I knew about Sharice Francis, who had died in Queens in 2012. And I just knew that any encounter with the police, even though I hadn't really been doing anything truly illegal, could go left and that my life could be in danger. It felt important to connect my personal story to some larger stories about Black folks' encounter with the police. And I guess the importance for folks who are listening here to think about is the intersections between the experiences of people with disability and people of color. The statistics, which I don't know off the top of my head, but about who dies in encounters with the police in terms of people with mental disabilities are really skewed in the sense that Black people are the most likely to die in these encounters. And I think that any approach to thinking about disability has to think also about the ways that disability intersects with the other identities that people with disabilities have. And so I'd say that my experience really is impossible to take away my other identities. Like I am a person with a disability, but I think my experiences as a Black woman definitely shape the way that I'm read by people, by medical folks, by police, by colleagues, by friends, the whole nine. So I'm not sure. I think, will I be able to get through all this? Okay. So I want to maybe talk a little bit. There's more to the essay, but I want to make sure that I'm able to get through the rest of my talk. I guess I'll just say, like, I talk about the friendships that were kind of destroyed by my illness and the painfulness of losing my closest friendships at the same time that I was really unmoored in my life in general. I talk about the way that this experience, my closest relationships with my husband and my sister and the other people who were involved in my life. And then I talk about my experience of moving towards recovery. So if you want to read the essay, you can obviously go onto the Harper site and check it out. And maybe we can put the link in the chat. But I want to return to some of the things that I wanted to say that aren't in the article, and maybe talk a little bit about the afterlife of this piece. So after my article came out, I had a surprising and illuminating conversation with my own beloved therapist. I told her that I identified as a person with a disability and that I'd referred to this in my essay. She didn't quite balk, but she paused and asked me to tell her what I meant by that. And then she told me that the term disabled has a very specific meaning, and it's usually related to the ability to work. I'm sure that everyone here assembled has thought about this, but I still bristle at the harmful idea that capitalism provides us that once humanity is centered in the ability to work or to go to school or otherwise be productive. The idea that I could not identify as a person with a disability because I'm able to work is astounding to me, even as I understand the ways that having a disability is a legal issue and the rights that I have today are based in legal arguments around ensuring equal access to schools, workplaces, public places, and the like. Still, I know that my identification as a person with a disability is precarious at best. Even as I'm able to teach full-time and take on part-time work to support my family, there are ongoing challenges related to my disability and my health. It might be helpful for me to speak here about the life insurance example that I related in my essay. I didn't get to this part, but I'll talk about it here. So in late 2018, I tried to get life insurance, but I was told that due to my bipolar diagnosis, I had to wait at least a year for my first hospitalization to reapply because the insurer wanted to be sure that I didn't commit suicide. A few years later, in 2020, I tried again to get insurance. This time, I proved myself capable of staying alive. But when I got diagnosed with thyroid cancer, I was told that getting life insurance would be an uphill battle and that at best I might get a more expensive policy if I could get any policy at all. Before I had a child and owned a home with my spouse, life insurance wasn't really a big deal to me. Frankly, it wasn't something that I thought about. And while I'm grateful that I have a policy through my work, it's a small one. This is just one way that my mental and physical health challenges continue to have a material impact on me. Earlier, I spoke about the ways that my illness and its afterlife have changed me, and I want to say more about that now. There are some bright lights to the way that my experiences have shaped who I am as a writer and a teacher. In the most basic way, I do believe that my body and mind were changed by those many months of laying down when I was first severely depressed, and then when my emotions were flattened out by medication. I do think that the experience of moving at such a slow pace changed the almost frenetic pace I had been working at before, and in a way, it prepared me for how to move through a pandemic where everything was much slower than it had been before. I want to talk briefly about how my experience with mental health has actually changed me as a teacher. So before, I used to like to bring a taskmaster, encouraging, if not punishing, energy to the way that I approached the teaching of creative writing. While I was a resident at the University of Pennsylvania's Kelly Writers House during the 2013-14 academic year, I started a writing boot camp for women of color. The boot camp was a way to build writing community, but the foundation of the program was the idea that what one needed for finishing a writing project was discipline and determination. That's certainly true, but it's not the approach that I center in my teaching now. The experience of losing several years of my creative life to my illness, and indeed wondering if I would ever write again, profoundly changed me and transformed my approach in how I talk to other writers about the creative process. Before, I believed that there was no such thing as writer's block, but the last several years have taught me that there really are seasons to creativity. There are dry seasons and rainy seasons, moments when the proverbial tap is on and you couldn't carry enough buckets to gather the flow. And then there are seasons when the idea well is empty, moments when the best way forward is to lean into surrender and being in receptive mode, revising, reading, tinkering, not trying to force your way through projects and impose unrealistic goals on them yourself. The teacher that I used to be never believed that there was an excuse to revise a writing goal or to walk away from a project entirely. The writer and person and teacher that I am now knows differently. I know that on the days when the effort to get up and stay out of bed, take a shower, brush your teeth, take your meds is too much, on those days, nothing good can come from self-flagellation and forcing yourself to do work that your mind simply can't do. There's no willing your way out of intractable depression. The great American novel was not written beneath the weight of crushing, untreated anxiety. Shame begets more shame, begets the very real and likely possibility that you can become an enemy of yourself and your creativity in the process of trying to get it all right. So I spoke a little bit about how mental health has changed me as a teacher, and I want to talk a bit about disclosure and the idea of what it means to disclose one's diagnoses and challenges. But I do know that disclosure matters. In a way, it matters most when it is high risk because the rewards are also considerable. The essay that I shared with you took approximately 15 months to write. I read several memoirs by people diagnosed with bipolar disorder. My research was in part to find out if I had anything new and interesting to add to the conversation. It was partly also to convince myself that it was possible to survive the gauntlet of self-disclosure with your personhood, your career, your family intact. Reading those pieces was a form of solace, a reminder, which I still need, that people who had experiences similar to my own went on to live productive lives. I wrote the essay that I did in part because so many of the accounts of people with severe mental illness are written by people who were writing from outside the experience. I wanted to write something that people who had firsthand experience could relate to, something that felt honest and real and raw. Now, I am both surprised and grateful when my students disclose their mental health diagnoses to me. I try to hold their disclosures in confidence, respecting the difficulty of sharing something so personal without taking on any inappropriate burden of repair or false intimacy. I think it's important to say that as much as I think disclosure is important, writing and then publishing this essay did come at a considerable emotional cost to myself. There was first the emotional difficulty of going through the roughly 12,000 words and 7 drafts of this essay over more than a year, and the way that that process forced me to retread very tender emotional ground. Then there was the fact checking process, which required that I share excerpts from the essay with my members of my family and friends and colleagues that I mentioned in it, so that they would have a chance to confirm, deny, refute my accounts of what happened. As you can imagine, this was very hard. I'm a conflict averse person, and yet I had to stand up to my father, who asked me several times to see the piece before it was published, first out of concern for me, and then, likely more honestly, out of concern of what my piece might do to our family. Um, so, I think for the sake of time, so that we can have some conversations, I'm going to move through this, but I'll just say briefly that this act of disclosure, and particularly the fact-checking process, was really difficult in terms of the conversations that it prompted with my sister and with my best friend, my former best friend, who I think was hurt by what I had to say about how her relationship was challenged. So disclosure hurt, and that was even before the rest of the world read it. I'd imagined several worst case scenarios upon publication: losing my job, losing more friends, getting sued, getting cussed out by people I loved. Thankfully, none of these things actually happened. Instead, something that I never anticipated, but that seems totally obvious to me now, happened. People started coming out of the woodwork, telling me about their own experiences with mental illness, their own or family members. They wanted to talk, and I wasn't sure what to do, having no formal training or frame of reference beyond my own experiences. I was at a loss, and I probably fumbled some of those conversations, even though I was grateful that my piece did have the impact of starting conversations. At the very least, I was grateful there was a pandemic still going on. I wouldn't have to run into my seventh grade teacher who read my essay and wanted to talk about it in the checkout line at Target. There were some relationships that were regained too in the publication process. I had at least one friend who called me to apologize for how she'd acted when I was sick, and since then we've been rebuilding our friendship. An editor of my work who kept her distance from me after one of my outbursts has since expressed interest in me and my work. There were also some surreal moments. After many years of applying, I finally was granted a research fellowship at the Schomburg Center in Harlem. When I was sick and went missing, my husband and sister went to the Schomburg Library looking for me. They took my picture, asked the security guards if anyone had seen me. It was ironic and a little bit triumphant that I'd gone from being a missing person to a scholar in residence there, and it felt extra special when the library posted my essay and publicly claimed both me and my work. What I've learned and what I'm still learning is that disability is not a destination, but an ongoing process. Much like coming out as a queer person felt for me in my 20s and 30s, disclosing one's disability is a difficult task made both more and less challenging by the fact that it has to be repeated over and over again. I'd never had any interaction with asking for disability accommodations until this past fall, when I had to ask for them in the wake of my thyroid cancer diagnosis. So originally, when I thought about, I first started my job at Rutgers Newark in fall 2020, I pored over the disability accommodations website, even printed and downloaded the paperwork to request an accommodation. But I found the process incredibly invasive and difficult and demoralizing. I just finished a 3-year process of completing the paperwork for a close family member's green card that at one point included letters from my agent, my doctor, my friends, my family, a picture of my baby in utero. I wasn't up for another invasive, potentially humiliating process. Beyond the questions on the forms themselves, even several years into my diagnosis and treatment, I actually didn't know what supports I needed or what I could reasonably ask for at work that would help me thrive. I knew what I had to do: sleep, eat regularly, get back on medication the moment I felt myself slipping, lay off drugs and alcohol, keep a schedule. But what could my work do for me? Furthermore, I worried about starting a new job asking for too much extra. I'd already negotiated for the first semester off from teaching since I just had a baby. I was a Black woman. Did I really want to add disabled to the baby mama stigma that I knew attached to me, even though I was a professional, highly educated, married, had a child months before my 40th birthday? I dared not risk it. But then life surprised me. I found myself staring down first an emergency thyroidectomy in the summer of 2021, and then a diagnosis of thyroid cancer. Not the most serious cancer in the world and has a 98% recovery rate, but the big C word rattled me. And beyond that was a series of boring but terrifying missteps and miscommunications with my doctors that meant I was placed on a too high dose of thyroid hormones that sent me flying into what eerily felt like the mania that I experienced in 2018. For several days, I barely slept. I had so much energy that I cleaned and tidied until my back ached. This followed upon the days immediately after surgery, when the effort of walking across the room felt impossible, the 13 stairs in our house insurmountable. Here I was, swinging unpredictably between highs and lows again. It scared me, and I knew that I didn't want to go to the hospital again. So I relented and figured that despite what I wanted to do, there was no way I could teach in person, much less handle the 5-hour round trip commute to Jersey to teach 2 graduate classes last fall. I gave in and decided to apply for an accommodation to teach online. It felt okay, in part because other people, folks who were immunocompromised, people whose children were still remote schooling, were asking for these arrangements. I wonder if it had been another time when other people weren't also figuring out how to take care of their needs and meet their work obligations, if I would have been too afraid to ask. I was surprised to find that the process of applying for an accommodation wasn't so bad. My psychiatrist rallied to fill out the paperwork, and the staff member who called me was kind and efficient, even asking me if I was sure that I didn't want to take a full semester of medical leave instead. After all those years of wondering what it might be like to officially ask for support, it felt really good to discover that I could have it relatively easily and that I wouldn't have to bounce through rings of fire to receive it. I want to wrap up my talk by thanking you again for the work that you do to support people of all ages and abilities to do their best work. I hope that what I've shared today offers a window onto the experiences around mental health, disclosure, teaching, requests for support. I hope that it changes the way that you think and feel about people who have mental disabilities. I hope it changes the way that you approach both your life and work. So that's it. That's the end of my talk. Thank you. I would be really grateful to hear anything that people have want to ask in the Q&A. I think Valerie and Aaron are going to be moderating, but I'm open to any and all questions. And I thank you all again. And I want to also thank Cheryl Warfield and Lauren Swain, who were also really important in terms of making this event happen today.
And Naomi, thank you so much for sharing your experiences. So there is one question in the chat already, or in the Q&A. So this is from Ryan. Naomi, could you talk about how students you've taught and supported have responded to the experiences you've shared through your writing?
Oh yeah, so I think thank you so much for that question. I think I'm not entirely sure of the full answer to it because I know that some of my students have read it, but not all of them have obviously talked to me about it. At least one of my students in the graduate program where I teach has this had, even before I wrote my essay, disclosed that she also was a person who had bipolar disorder. And after we had a chance to talk about my essay, and that was really gratifying to feel like I could have a live and direct conversation with an emerging writer about how my writing has opened up some space for them to talk about their own experiences with mental health. I think, as I said at the very beginning of the talk, I really feel like my students actually are way ahead of me in terms of thinking about disability. And they have like a really rad sense of the importance of taking up space in the world. They have so much less shame and uncertainty than I have. And so I feel like in my relationships with my students, I'm usually taking more of a learning seat than a teaching seat. So even though I published this thing and I think it was very important, I think I would say that it has opened up some conversations, but I think that I'm the person who stands to be in the position to learn the most from my students' experiences. Um, so yeah, I've really loved the few conversations that I've been able to have with my students, but I guess I would say I'm not sure exactly what people are saying about it, and I'm not sure if it's my business unless they want to come talk to me. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And so Caitlin wants to know if you could share the title of your book, and she also has a request for us to include the link to the piece, which I'm sure Erin can speak to how we can make that happen.
Yeah, it's on. Yeah, okay. I think I can't do two things at once, so I'll put Aaron is on that. So my novel is called The Star Side of Bird Hill, and it's a coming of age story set in Brooklyn and Barbados in the late 80s. And like the basic story is about these two girls who get sent home from Brooklyn to Barbados to spend the summer with their grandmother because their mother can't take care of them. And the mother in that novel is suffering from mental illness, which makes her unable to parent her kids. So it actually works through a lot of the same themes, but I think with like more humor, like more of a balance of like humor and lightness than the piece that I share here. But that's fine. I think everybody knew the content of what I was going to share. So if you'd like to read the novel, go ahead. Please buy my novel. Enjoy it if you get to it. Yeah.
Great. And so another question from Suzanne. This was a remarkable accounting of your experience. How did you accept your diagnosis and agree to take the medication? I know many who could not accept either and would love to hear how you managed.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an ongoing question, right? So I think, in the earlier section of the essay that I read, I think when I originally got the diagnosis, I felt like it belonged to someone else. Like, I think it took me a minute to understand what was happening. I was really bewildered by everything that was going on. And I think it helped that I had actually had family members who had gone through this because I had been the person on the other end, kind of wanting my family members to comply. I would say I pushed back a little bit on that the framework of acceptance. You didn't say compliance, but I think the medical industry does move towards compliance. And I find, especially because now I am the person in the seat as the patient, I really find that framework so problematic and has more carceral feel than I think is appropriate for dealing with human beings who are trying to figure out how to best take care of themselves. I mean, to be frank, in the beginning, I didn't really, in order to get out of the hospital, I had to take my medication. And then, when I got out of the hospital, the last hospitalization that I had, my husband was kind of the enforcer in terms of, you have to take this medication, and this is the thing that's going to make you able to be in the world again. So the initial response to it was pretty involuntary, to be frank. It was the thing that allowed me to have my freedom again, and to be out in the world. And then, in my relationships with my family and with my husband, which was very important to me, it was basically a condition of continuing to be in relationship to the people who I cared about. And so those were the things that most motivated me. I think you'd have to read the essay for you to hear some of the things that I talked about. I'm also, in the spirit of transparency, I'm not currently on medication. I'm breastfeeding my child, and so the medications are I don't know, I'm not going to try to be a doctor. I can't take those medications and be breastfeeding at the same time. I've been fine. I continue to be okay, and I'm grateful for that. But I'm also very aware, like the experience that I recounted of having this thyroidectomy and then basically getting into this almost manic state really was a reality check in terms of realizing how quickly things could turn for me. So I'm not anti-medication at any point. When I need it, I will be on it, because I know that if it's the thing that stands between me being okay and being able to be in my life, I'd rather do that than kind of decompensate and not be in my life.
Thank you so much, Naomi. So at this point, there are no more questions in the chat. So unless anyone has anything else they want to submit.
Okay, and I think Erin was going to work on the.
Erin posted the link in the published question section.
Okay, great.
So nothing has come through.
Okay, well, I want to come in to wrap up and to first and foremost thank you, Naomi, for this incredible talk, for the spirit of generosity that you brought to this exploration and to sharing all this with us. I think that what the attendees gained from this experience will change their practice. I really hope that it will. And hopefully people who were not able to join us today will visit the Symposium website to catch the recording of this insightful session. Thank you to all the attendees who tuned in today. This is a reminder that after a break, we will be back at 1:30 p.m. for our final plenary speaker of the day, Rebecca Taussig, with her talk titled Blueprints for the Future, Disability and Innovation. When you come back at 1:30, please be sure to use the unique link. It's a different link for that session. Thank you again, Naomi. Thank you for everyone who joined us today.
Thanks, everybody.